As an IT specialist, I've always found solace in the hum of servers and the glow of computer screens. It's why, when most of my colleagues were packing their bags for Holy Week, I chose to stay behind in our 25-story office building in the heart of the city. The thought of a quiet workspace, free from the usual bustle, was more appealing to me than any beachside retreat. The morning air was crisp as I made my way through the nearly deserted streets. Our capital, usually a thriving metropolis, had transformed into a ghost town overnight. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing vehicle or the distant bark of a stray dog. As I approached our building, I couldn't shake off an inexplicable feeling of unease. I nodded a greeting to Mr. Tan, our jovial security guard, as I entered the lobby. His cheerful "Good morning, Michael" echoed in the empty space, seeming louder than usual. I made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Tan's round face, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The elevator dinged as it reached the 8th floor, our company's domain. I stepped out, the familiar sight of our office space greeting me. But even here, the holiday's impact was palpable. The usual buzz of activity was replaced by an unsettling quiet, broken only by the gentle hum of idle computers. I wasn't entirely alone, though. As I settled into my workspace, I saw Thomas, our perpetually stressed boss, emerge from his office. His gray long-sleeve polo shirt seemed to blend with his pasty complexion, making him look more like a ghost than a man. He gave me a curt nod before disappearing back into his lair, the door closing with a soft click. Over the next hour, the rest of our skeleton crew trickled in. Jason, our network administrator, arrived next. The bags under his eyes spoke volumes about the challenges of being a single dad. He mumbled a greeting as he passed, already immersed in whatever crisis awaited him on his laptop. Sophia and Adrian arrived together, their laughter a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere. Sophia's petite frame seemed dwarfed by Adrian's flamboyant presence, despite him being only a few inches taller. They huddled by the water cooler, their whispered conversation punctuated by occasional giggles. The last to arrive was Daniel, my best friend and fellow IT enthusiast. His slim figure appeared in the doorway, a grin spreading across his face as he spotted me. Ready for a thrilling day of holiday tech support, he quipped, pulling up a chair next to mine. As we settled into our work, I couldn't help but notice the strange atmosphere that had settled over the office. The usual banter and friendly chatter were replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the clatter of keyboards and the occasional sigh. Outside our windows, the city lay dormant, as if holding its breath. It wasn't until mid-morning that I first noticed something truly out of the ordinary. Glancing out the window during a brief coffee break, I spotted a group of soldiers setting up barricades around our building. Their movements were precise, almost robotic, as they cordoned off the area. A chill ran down my spine as I watched them, their presence a jarring contrast to the holiday calm. I turned to Daniel, about to point out the strange scene, when a commotion from the direction of the elevators caught our attention. Mr. Tan burst into the office, his usually jolly face contorted with panic. "Something's happened in the food hall," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "A man, he just collapsed after drinking his coffee." In that moment, as we all exchanged confused and worried glances, I had no idea that this was just the beginning. The quiet holiday I had anticipated was about to transform into a nightmare beyond my wildest imagination. Little did I know, our familiar office building was about to become a battleground for survival, and the city I thought I knew was harboring secrets that were about to turn my world upside down. Mr. Tan's words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken dread. For a moment, we all stood frozen, unsure how to react. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, chaos erupted. Thomas barked orders, his face flushed with panic, while Sophia and Adrian huddled together, whispering frantically. I caught Daniel's eye, and we shared a look of mutual confusion and concern. As an IT specialist, my first instinct was to check our systems. I rushed to my computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as I attempted to pull up our building's security feeds. But as I clicked through various applications, a sinking feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. Nothing was responding. Our internet connection had vanished, leaving us cut off from the outside world. "Daniel," I called out, my voice tight with growing anxiety. "Can you check the phone lines?" He nodded, reaching for the nearest desk phone. The look on his face, as he held the receiver to his ear, told me everything I needed to know. We were completely isolated. As we grappled with our sudden disconnection from the outside world, a blood-curdling scream tore through the office. It came from the direction of the server room, where Jason had been working on some routine maintenance. Daniel and I exchanged a quick glance before sprinting towards the sound, our hearts pounding in our chests. The scene that greeted us as we burst into the server room will forever be etched in my memory. Jason was on the floor, desperately trying to fend off Sophia and Adrian. But there was something terribly wrong with our colleagues. Their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, their eyes glazed over with a primal hunger. They were attacking Jason with a ferocity that seemed inhuman. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and swung it at Adrian, catching him in the side and sending him sprawling. Daniel managed to pull Sophia off Jason, but she immediately turned on him, snapping and snarling like a rabid animal. In the chaos, Jason scrambled to his feet and bolted from the room. We followed close behind, slamming the door shut and wedging a chair under the handle. Panting and shaken, we retreated to the main office area, but our relief was short-lived. Thomas emerged from his office, but the man who stood before us was not the boss we knew. His eyes were vacant, his mouth twisted in a grotesque snarl. Behind him, I could see Mr. Tan and the receptionists, all exhibiting the same terrifying behavior. As the reality of our situation began to sink in, a horrifying thought struck me. The man in the food hall, the coffee he had been drinking. Could it be connected? I shared my suspicion with Daniel, watching as the color drained from his face. "We need to get out of here," he whispered urgently. We made a dash for the elevators, but as the doors slid open, we were met with a sight that made my blood run cold. The lobby was filled with soldiers, their weapons trained on the building's entrance. One of them spotted us and shouted a warning. "Stay inside. Anyone who tries to leave will be shot on sight." Trapped between the infected above and the military below, Daniel and I retreated into the stairwell. As we caught our breath, trying to process the nightmare we had found ourselves in, a new sound reached our ears. From somewhere below, we could hear screams and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Driven by a morbid curiosity and the desperate need for answers, we cautiously made our way down to the second floor where the food hall was located. As we pushed open the door to the cafe, the sight that greeted us nearly made me retch. The barista, a young man I had exchanged pleasantries with just yesterday, was crouched over the body of his colleague. But he wasn't helping her. He was feeding on her. Daniel tugged at my arm, his face ashen. "We can't stay here," he hissed, eyes darting nervously around the room. I nodded, too shocked to speak. As we backed away from the gruesome scene, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. One thing was clear: whatever this was, it was spreading fast, and it seemed to be connected to the coffee. We needed a plan, a way to navigate this nightmare without falling victim to either the infected or the military outside. As we huddled in a corner of the stairwell, an idea struck me. "The ventilation system," I whispered to Daniel. "If we can access it, we might be able to move around the building without being detected." Daniel's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. It was a long shot, but it was the best option we had. As we began to formulate our plan, I couldn't shake the feeling that our familiar office building had transformed into a labyrinth of horrors. What had started as a quiet holiday workday had become a fight for survival, and I had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The ventilation system of our 25-story office building had always been a source of complaints during staff meetings. Too cold, too noisy, too dusty. But now, it was our lifeline. Daniel and I stood before an access panel in a secluded corner of the 8th floor, our hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. As an IT specialist, I was more accustomed to navigating digital labyrinths than physical ones. But desperate times call for desperate measures, as they say. With trembling hands, I pried open the panel, revealing a dark, claustrophobic tunnel that disappeared into the bowels of the building. "After you," Daniel whispered, his attempt at humor falling flat in the face of our grim situation. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead, and crawled into the duct. The metal was cool against my palms, and the confined space immediately set my nerves on edge. Daniel followed close behind, his breathing echoing in the narrow passage. As we inched our way through the ventilation system, the sounds of chaos below filtered up to us. Screams, crashes, and inhuman growls reverberated through the metal ducts. Each noise made us freeze, our bodies tense with the fear of being discovered. Through small grates, we caught glimpses of the horror unfolding in the offices and corridors below. In the finance department on the 7th floor, we saw our normally prim and proper accountants tearing into each other with savage abandon. Their once immaculate suits were now stained with blood, their faces contorted into masks of primal hunger. I felt bile rise in my throat as I watched a scene that belonged more in a nightmare than in our mundane office building. "What do you think caused this?" Daniel whispered as we paused to catch our breath. "It has to be the coffee, right? But how? Why?" I shook my head, at a loss for answers. As an IT specialist, I dealt in logic and systems, in ones and zeros. This defied all reason, all natural laws. It was a virus, yes, but one that turned humans into monsters in a matter of minutes. We continued our perilous journey, the metal ducts creaking ominously under our weight. Every sound, every shift in the structure sent spikes of panic through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment, the thin barrier between us and the infected could give way. As we neared a junction in the ventilation system, a new sound caught our attention. It was the unmistakable crackle of a military radio. We exchanged a glance, then carefully made our way towards the source of the sound. Peering through a grate, we found ourselves looking down on a group of soldiers in the lobby. Their conversation drifted up to us, fragments of a larger, more terrifying picture. Containment protocol. No survivors. Government experiment. The words chilled me to the bone. This was no random outbreak. Someone somewhere had unleashed this horror deliberately. But why? And how are we supposed to survive not just the infected, but also a military determined to eliminate all witnesses? Lost in these dark thoughts, I almost didn't notice when Daniel shifted his weight. The metal beneath him groaned, louder than before. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. For a moment, it seemed we had escaped detection. Then, with a sickening crack, the duct gave way. Time seemed to slow as Daniel fell. I reached out, desperately trying to grab him, but my fingers closed on empty air. He crashed onto a desk below, the sound of his impact echoing through the now silent lobby. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, like a wave crashing on the shore, the infected swarmed towards him. Daniel. I screamed, horror and despair threatening to overwhelm me. But there was nothing I could do. From my vantage point in the duct, I watched as my best friend disappeared under a tide of grasping hands and gnashing teeth. His screams would haunt me for the rest of my life. Tears blurred my vision as I scrambled backward, away from the grate, away from the nightmare below. I wanted to curl up and give in to despair, but the sounds of the infected trying to reach the ventilation system spurred me on. Daniel's sacrifice couldn't be in vain. I had to survive, had to escape, had to tell the world what had happened here. With renewed determination, I pushed on through the ventilation system. My movements were fueled by a potent mixture of grief, fear, and anger. How many more lives would be lost to this madness? How many more Daniels would be sacrificed before this was over? As I crawled, a plan began to form in my mind. The building's waste disposal system. If I could reach it, it might provide a way out. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. With every meter I traversed, the weight of survival pressed heavier on my shoulders. I was no longer just Michael, the introverted IT specialist. I was now a survivor, possibly the only one who could expose the truth behind this horrific day. The ventilation shaft seemed endless, a metal maze that twisted and turned through the building's skeleton. Every junction was a decision, every turn a risk. But I pressed on, Daniel's final screams echoing in my ears, driving me forward. Whatever lay ahead, whatever horrors I might still face, I knew one thing for certain. I would not let this nightmare go unanswered. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The acrid smell of garbage hit me like a wall as I finally reached the end of the ventilation shaft. My muscles screamed in protest as I pushed open the final grate, tumbling unceremoniously into a large industrial dumpster. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I lay there, gasping for breath amidst the refuse of our once ordinary office life. As I struggled to my feet, the reality of my situation came crashing down on me. I was alive, but at what cost? The image of Daniel disappearing under a wave of infected colleagues flashed before my eyes, threatening to overwhelm me. But I couldn't afford to break down, not yet. I was out of the building, but far from safe. Cautiously, I peered over the edge of the dumpster. The alley behind our office building was deserted, an eerie calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos I'd left behind. In the distance, I could hear sirens and the occasional burst of gunfire. The city I'd known all my life had transformed into a war zone in the span of a single day. With shaking limbs, I hoisted myself out of the dumpster, wincing as my feet hit the concrete. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. An infected colleague, a trigger-happy soldier, or something even worse. I pressed myself against the cool brick of the building, straining my ears for any sign of danger. As I inched my way along the alley, my mind raced, trying to make sense of everything I'd seen and heard. The infected, turning on each other with inhuman ferocity. The soldiers, talking about containment protocols and government experiments. The coffee that seemed to be at the center of it all. Each piece of the puzzle was terrifying on its own, but together, they painted a picture too horrific to fully comprehend. I reached the end of the alley and peered around the corner. The street beyond was empty, the usual bustle of our busy capital replaced by an oppressive silence. In the distance, I could see the barricades the soldiers had set up earlier, now abandoned. Whatever had happened inside our building, it had clearly spread beyond its walls. With no clear destination in mind, I began to move through the deserted streets. Every step felt like a gamble, every crossroad a potential trap. The city I'd called home for 27 years had become alien and hostile. Overturned cars, shattered windows, and ominous dark stains on the pavement told a story of panic and violence that had swept through while I was trapped in the office building. As I walked, the events of the day replayed in my mind. The collapsed man in the food hall, the first domino to fall in this cascade of horrors. Sophia and Adrian, their eyes vacant as they attacked Jason. Thomas, Mr. Tan, and the others, transformed into mindless, violent shells of themselves. And Daniel, oh God, Daniel, my best friend, lost in an instant of bad luck and failing infrastructure. I don't know how long I wandered before I found myself in a small park, one of the few green spaces in our concrete jumble of a city. The trees and bushes, untouched by the madness that had consumed the human population, seemed to offer a moment of respite. I collapsed onto a bench, my body finally giving in to the exhaustion and stress of the past 36 hours. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing thoughts, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. This was no isolated incident, no contained outbreak. The soldiers' presence, their talk of protocols and experiments, suggested something far more sinister, Someone somewhere had unleashed this horror on purpose. But why? What could possibly justify turning people into mindless, violent monsters? The sound of distant gunfire jolted me from my thoughts. I couldn't stay here. As much as I wanted to curl up and pretend this was all a bad dream, I knew that wasn't an option. I was a witness now, perhaps one of the few who knew the truth about what had happened. If I was caught by the military, or worse, by whatever organization was behind this outbreak, that truth would die with me. With a heavy heart, I pushed myself to my feet. I had to leave the city, find somewhere safe, somewhere I could gather my thoughts and figure out what to do next. But even as I made this decision, a part of me rebelled against it. This was my home, my life. How could I just walk away? But then I remembered the look in Sophia's eyes as she attacked Jason, devoid of any humanity. I remembered the soldier's cold voice as he threatened to shoot anyone trying to leave the building. I remembered Daniel's final scream as he was overwhelmed. And I knew that the city I loved, the life I had known, was gone. As I stood at the edge of the park, preparing to take my first steps towards an uncertain future, I took one last look at the skyline. Our office building stood there, a monument to the ordinary life I'd left behind just this morning. Now it was a tomb, a place of horrors that I'd only barely escaped. I turned away, my jaw set with determination. I didn't know where I was going, or what I would do when I got there. But I knew one thing for certain. The truth of what had happened here needed to come out. Someone had to be held accountable for the lives lost. The city destroyed. The horror unleashed. As an IT specialist, I'd always lived in a world of logic and order, codes and systems that, while complex, always followed predictable rules. But now I found myself in a world where those rules no longer applied, where the familiar had become deadly, and where survival meant embracing the unknown. With each step that took me further from the heart of the city, I felt a mix of fear and resolve growing within me. Fear of what lay ahead, of the dangers I might face, of the possibility that nowhere was truly safe anymore, but also resolve to survive, to understand, and ultimately, to expose the truth behind this catastrophe. The sun was setting as I reached the outskirts of the city, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed all too fitting for the day's events. As I looked back one last time at the place I'd called home, I made a silent promise. To Daniel, to my colleagues, to everyone who had fallen victim to this unexplainable horror, I would survive. I would find answers, and no matter what it took, I would make sure the world knew the truth about what had happened here. With that thought steeling my resolve, I turned and walked into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the familiar skyline and stepping into a world forever changed. The quiet IT specialist was gone, replaced by a survivor with a mission. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever horrors I might still face, I was determined to see this through. The nightmare that had begun in our office building was far from over, but I was no longer trapped within its walls. Now, the real journey was just beginning.